Boom. Okay, folks. Hope you're doing well. It's Michael with the Reason RX podcast. Back again. 18 May 2021. Episode 55 or something or other like that. It'll be in the name of the title, so we'll know, whatever. But hope you're doing well. Today, we are going to talk with, let me see, where is this information I had it at? Where'd it go? My notes are disappearing. Get rid of this. Ah, there we are. Okay, yeah. I want to make sure I read everything out. Okay. Today, we are fortunate to talk to Dr. Jim Lennox, a professor emeritus of history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh. Many publications and articles, too numerous to mention, but I'll put them in the show notes for people to see. But some things like a book coming out, Aristotle on Inquiry, coming out, Thursday? And
that's right.
A book, Aristotle on the Parts of Animals, Aristotle's Philosophy of Biology, Essays on the Origins of Life. And he's co-edited Concepts and Their Role in Knowledge, Reflections on Objectivist Epistemology, Metaphysics, Egoism, and Virtue, Studies in Ayn Rand's Normative Theory, Being, Nature, and Life in Aristotle, and others. And he's held fellowships at Harvard's Center for Hellenic Studies and at the University of Bologna's Institute for Advanced Study, and many other things. So, hello, Jim. How you doing? Could you say hi to folks, please?
I'm doing well.
Cool.
Been a good day here. It's sunny, 80 degrees. Had a lovely run in Frick Park this morning.
Nice. We're going to have a high here of like 83. Humid. Been having a lot of rain.
Yeah, it's been dry here.
Cool. How far did you go running?
5.5 miles. Frick Park is very hilly, so we ran 5.5 miles and covered about 500 feet of elevation during that time.
Nice. What pace do you go at?
Much slower than I used to.
Yeah.
Yeah, right now we're averaging somewhere between 9 and 10-minute miles. When I was in my 40s, I was one of the better, back when you probably knew me as a professor, I was one of the better masters runners in this part of the country and was able to run 10Ks around 33 or 34 minutes. But those days are long gone.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to post on my blog and on Facebook about some of that sometime. It's interesting looking up world records for different events on Wikipedia and seeing how times change, reflecting strength and power. 100-meter dashes, marathons, the shot put, the javelin, jumping, things like that. But it looks like when I graph it, an interesting thing is it looks pretty much like a linear decline. I would have expected maybe some kind of slow decline and then like an exponential at the end or something, but it's, even 30s to 90s, it looks like pretty linear. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's been that way with me, and I'm like in major races when I'm looking at my times in the 70 to 74 age group. I'm still one of the best runners in that age group. So
Cool.
I haven't lost quality relative to other people my age. I've just lost quality relative to who I was when I was in my 40s.
Yeah. Cool. And it's a good thing to keep at it. I know a biologist, world-class biologist, some of whose books I've read. I've interviewed him a few times. Dr. Bernd Heinrich. Mm-hmm. He's written on, as I've mentioned to folks, um, how wasps warm themselves up to fly, how the moth cools itself down. He's written on raven intelligence. So a broad range of not just work, but cutting edge work. Really world-class scholarship. And yeah, when he was in his 40s, 30s or 40s, he's, I don't know, 82, 85 or so now. But he used to do long distance running, and he's still, to this day, even though that was like in the 80s, he's still in the top 10 in the United States for 50-mile run, 100-mile run, and 24-hour run.
Yeah.
And he still runs. I don't remember how far every day, 6 miles, 10 miles, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the far I've never gone beyond marathons. I did a lot of
Yeah.
marathoning in my 40s and early 50s. And I kept marathoning so long as I kept thinking that each marathon would be a little faster than my previous one. When I got to the point where it was pretty clear that each one was going to be a little slower than the previous one,
Yeah.
I decided to give up. I mean, I've always really loved competitive sports. This is built into my character. When I was very young, when I was born, my parents bought a home not a home, a cottage, summer cottage on Lake Huron. I was living in Toronto at that time. And I could swim before I could walk, actually, because the beach by our cottage was dead flat with sandbars that went out, half a mile. And they used to just take me down there as an infant and just push me back and forth between them in the shallow water. And before long, I was swimming. And I got into competitive swimming when I was 6 or 7 years of age. And unlike many people, I discovered that competition excited me. I looked forward to it.
Cool.
I didn't ever feel any anxiety, and I never, to this day, I don't either. I never got down on myself if I had a poor performance. And that's just part of my character now. When I started running, which I didn't start until I was 35 or 36, I guess, I immediately wanted to get into competitive running. It keeps my training more exciting and interesting to me, and it gives me something to look forward to all the time. So it's sort of built into my character to look at a sport like running or swimming or whatever it might be, and think about, are there people I can compete with in this sport?
Yeah, it's interesting in contrast. I think I was autistic spectrum or something growing up. I was never tested, but looking back, looking at all these different variables, measurements of being human, I think so, or something like that anyway. And so, in contrast for me, I hated competition.
Yeah.
Just because of the social thing. It's like, don't look at me like a little elementary school kid. Don't look at me, leave me alone, and stuff like that. So, I prefer of course, we're social animals. Everyone likes being alone and being in groups, being social.
Mm-hmm.
That's just in our nature. But a lot of stuff I like doing, like more solitary fitness stuff, or even if it's like something you're doing with other people, you're kind of doing it alone and not so much like a sport competition. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, one of the great things about competitive swimming and competitive running is, of course, in the end, you're competing against yourself.
Mm-hmm.
How well you do is something that's measured by a clock and not measured by other people's evaluations of you. If you've been training, you know what to expect of yourself, and there's an objective measure of whether you've lived up to that or not. namely the clock.
Yeah. And it's interesting. That's like when Baron Heinrich did his runs. Since he was a scientist, he wanted it to be something uniform, his 50 mile and 100 mile, and comparable to other things. And so when you're doing an experiment, you need to eliminate variables to find the essence or find the cause. And so when he did it, he did not do it on a 50-mile trail run because all the trails are different. Mm-hmm. There's all these different variables. He did it on a track. Oh. Imagine running 50 miles on a quarter-mile track.
I can't. That is the essence of boredom for me. Yeah, when I run, I love running on trails. I mean, we live right. The street we live on is a dead-end street that dead ends into the middle of Frick Park.
Cool.
And it's, of the two major parks in Pittsburgh, it's the Wilderness Park. And yeah, that's where I do all my running. It's also great for my joints because it's soft trails. It's not,
sure.
You're not running on hard surfaces.
And it's one thing I found interesting recently. I run on trails also. I love it. The complexity, how you have to adapt. There's a lot more mental going on. Mm-hmm. I used to run on the street, and you can just tune out and be mindless like a machine, blah, 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 pound it out. Here, no, it's like there are bicyclers out there, people walking their dogs. There's animals out there. I got to watch for snakes because I don't want to hurt them. And I want to, like, take pictures for iNaturalists and stuff like that. Excuse me. And there's, like, it's a little rolling and winding around here. No hills like what you got, but
right.
These teeny tiny Houston hills anyway. And so I've been doing that, and I've done, sometimes a mile or two, sometimes 5 or 7. I need to do more like 10 to 15 things, build up, but done some of that. But recently, my truck was in the auto shop. I was at my mechanic's, and I'm thinking, okay, I got a friend in Minneapolis. Can she drive me there? Nope, too far away. A friend in Dallas. Can she or her husband or her daughter drive me there? Nope, too far away. Oh, a friend in, like, Galveston. That's too far away. Oh, wait, this person's working. Well, to hell with it. How far is it? I look it up. 6.7 miles. I can do that. I ran.
Of course.
But the thing that was interesting was it ended up being like 5.5 miles, but I'm running on flat grass on the side of the road. But after about 2 miles, my feet started getting numb. That hasn't happened in years. The only time I remember that happening was when I was also running on concrete. When I'm running on the trails, I go farther. I'm not stopping at stoplights. That does not happen. So that was really interesting that my feet got numb like that. And I had to walk for 300 yards to walk it out. And then I was better and it didn't happen again. But, so the trails, for that reason too, are just much superior for me.
Yep.
Have your joints been fine all this time? Have you had any joint problems, any replacements or anything?
No.
Cool.
Part of the reason for that is I have I have a support team. I get massages every other week from the same person that's been doing it forever, sports massage. I have a physical therapist who teaches physical therapy at the Pitt Medical School.
Cool.
And she has convinced me that a lot of people joint problems are due to the fact that they don't watch out for the proper muscle balance in the muscles around their joints.
Yeah.
I have very little cartilage in my left knee at this point. And that started to bother me about 7 or 8 years ago. And she said, we can deal with that. And what she did was she did an evaluation of the muscles in the leg just above the knee and just below the knee. And she realized that there was a lack of balance in those muscles and tendons. And she started to she put me on a regimen of exercises to strengthen all of the muscles around the knee, and in
Sweet.
particular to get the muscles on the inside of the leg in balance with those on the outside of the leg. Because what she'd noticed was that my kneecap was sliding way over to the outside
Hmm.
of, and that was what was causing a lot of the pain that I was feeling.
Hmm.
And yeah, I've been convinced over and over again that people could overcome a lot of their apparent joint problems by working on stretching and strengthening the muscles around the joints. It's worked for me at least. And this is a kind of therapy that she does with almost everyone that comes to her with complaints about joint pain. Before she recommends any kind of medication, before she recommends any kind of shots, steroids, or anything, before she recommends joint replacements, she says, let's see if we can handle it by strengthening and stretching exercises. And
Cool.
it's worked beautifully in my case.
Sweet. Yeah. That's what I found in studying, training, learning to become a certified fitness trainer in functional fitness, and then, excuse me, doing my own researching and reading beyond that. A lot of issues are not in our nature, some kind of original fitness sin or something. It's the way people use their animal self in their bodies when they're running. It's a matter of poor technique, ignorance of it through no fault of their own. It's the culture we live in. It's not the body as such. They need to, we need to reinstitute some stuff we knew before. Just like there's stuff people learn in history, and then it's forgotten later in history. It's some of the stuff with fitness too. We need to return to more focus in the culture and in physical education in schools on individual training and technique. There's sports are overdone. Sports are part of it. Historically, for millennia, I think what the ancient Greeks, some of the stuff people do more modern, like Laprati at La Sierra in the 60s, would have martial arts, sports, and the individual fitness component. And the individual fitness component is the base because that determines how you're going to work and move and function in the others. So one way to put it is like Gray Cook of FMS, Functional Movement Screen, says, and that's something used in the NFL, NHL, I think, very well known in the elite sports. Gray Cook says, move often, but first, move well.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to work on that individual moving well with everyone, and that would help them run better and avoid injuries. Or like Kelly Starrett, PhD in like biomechanics or something like that. Excuse me. Runs mobility and CrossFit. He found that himself. He didn't like running. He hated it. He'd be injured. When he learned about technique, whenever it was, before his PhD, during, after, but when he learned about technique, how to do it right, when he started doing more barefoot or minimalist shoes, the stuff went away, and I think he even ran a 50-mile run. It was a matter of doing it right and moving well that helped him, helps other people. Something we need to do. Getting
Well,
that.
I'm fortunate in that I have the swimming, so I do a lot of cross training. So
Cool.
I at least twice a week I do a 2,000-yard workout in the swimming pool at the JCC, which is real nearby here. And I cycled yesterday, ran today. It's getting difficult for me to get all of my exercise in because I used to play a lot of golf when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
Gave it up because of my career was just it's a very time-consuming sport.
Mm-hmm.
But when I retired, I went back to it in 2019. I said, well, let's see whether I still have a decent golf swing. And now I'm doing that as well. My wife and I kayak, so there's
Sweet.
just a limited amount of time to do all these things. But
Yeah.
I find that the cross training is really, really important. The swimming uses muscles I don't use when I'm running or cycling. The cycling uses the upper leg muscles way more than the running does. So you get a real balance in your muscles by doing the cross training, by getting all the different muscles working. And any particular sport, uses only a limited set of muscles. But if you're working on 3 or 4 different things, then you have a better balance in your muscle frame.
Yeah.
Well, this wasn't supposed to be just talk about
Yeah, I was thinking that too. But cool. So we started talking about our day and got into fitness, the importance, how to do it right, the nature of it. But anything else? Let's see. So I had introduced you, Professor Emeritus of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. Talked about some of your works and things. Anything else you'd like to add about your background, your interests, your expertise?
Yeah. So for those in your audience that don't know about this discipline of history and philosophy of science, I'm now retired. That's what the emeritus means. But for 40 years, I was in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. And it's one of the few universities in the world that has such a department. There's only a handful of them worldwide.
And I'd like to say really quickly, and unfortunately, when I was young, because of the autism, it affects people differently. This doesn't apply to everybody, but it applied to me because it's a spectrum. But unfortunately, when I went there, like because you and some others were there, but I was too young and too stupid to take advantage of it. That is like one of the Mars of my life. I wish I had been able to like go there and like study under you as a reasonable person. But I remember then epistemologically at the time, I wasn't really an independent thinker, didn't quite know how, was still trying to figure it out. I remember noticing that sometimes, or often, too often, I wouldn't believe something unless I read it or someone else, like an authority, said it. I didn't yet know how to think independently.
Mm-hmm.
But so in high school, basically, I just tuned out. 2.6 GPA, didn't care. Great in math, 102s every 6 weeks in calculus. Everything else I hated, didn't even care. Couldn't even write a 5-paragraph paper when I finished high school. If I did, it would be horrible. So I had to do a lot of work after that to really learn how to be reasonable, rational, engage in independent thought, think for myself. Kind of like some French diplomat, I forgot his name, World War I think it was. But he said, everything I learned after I was 30. It's like, that's me. So unfortunately, I was there, I met Jim, but man, I couldn't like work with him or take advantage of this. So when people will hear the podcast, they'll realize what kind of opportunity I missed.
Well,
but, go ahead.
What you described is not radically different than the majority of undergraduates I encountered during my days. But at any rate, I think it might be interesting to know that when you hear history and philosophy of science, I find most people don't know how to put all those words together. They don't know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And they may think, all right, I understand history of science. say, physics or biology. It must have started at some point, and it must have developed historically, like most things do. Philosophy of science. What's that? I don't understand what philosophy of science is. And moreover, what does it mean that there's a combination of the study of the history of science and a study of the philosophy of science? And it isn't just a combination. It's, in my view, the two disciplines are integrated, and you do better work in studying the history of science if you have some philosophical questions that you're asking about the scientists that you're studying. And you have a better, more concrete, more realistic view of what's going on philosophically in science if you understand how that science developed historically. So I see the two studies as very integrated. And in fact, the distinction between, and I think this would help your audience, the distinction between philosophy and science is an artifact of some very recent intellectual developments. If you go back to, say, Isaac Newton, or Carl Linnaeus, or Charles Darwin, all of those people would have referred to themselves as philosophical naturalists or natural philosophers. Science was just viewed as, well, philosophy about the natural world. It's a particular kind of philosophy. It's a particular kind of abstract theoretical thinking about a particular subject, namely how bodies move, what distinguishes animals from plants, how do we understand the way animals develop, how do we understand the relationship between an animal's body and its functional capacities, and so on. It's only very recently that, and I could go into the details at some point if we wanted to, but it's not, I don't think that important. But it's only very recently that the general public and professionals in the two disciplines have seen what they were doing as radically different. And I think that's unfortunate. I think every scientist thinks philosophically about their subject insofar, to use the language you just used, insofar as they're independent thinkers, insofar as they're not just mimicking what their lab partners or their professors are doing, insofar as they're actually thinking independently about whatever subject it is they're studying, whether it's genetics or evolution or chemistry or physics or whatever. They have to have fundamental questions about the nature of what they're studying, what's the proper way to study it, what's the proper way to gain evidence about this subject that can help me reach conclusions about what's going on causally in the thing that they're studying. All of that is really philosophical thinking. And the scientists that we think of as making all the great contributions to their disciplines, the Newtons, the Einsteins, the Darwins, the Archimedes, the Galileos, whatever, if you look at any one of them, they all were deep philosophical thinkers. They weren't just carrying out a set of experiments according to some kind of protocol that they'd been taught. These were people who were thinking very fundamentally about the nature of reality, the nature of life, about how the human mind has to function in order to understand the nature of reality, Um, uh, and I know at one point you sent me some questions, and one of the questions was, why do so many scientists have a negative view of philosophy? That was never the case until the 20th century, basically. Um, and it's because of a very bad, in my view, turn uh, in philosophy that the two areas of human understanding went in kind of opposite directions. Um, Philosophy became a kind of abstract game that you were trained to play. And philosophers or scientists, maybe as undergraduates or graduate students, would take courses and they would say, that has nothing to do with what I'm doing. And they were probably right. But that was just because they were being exposed to bad philosophy.
Yeah. As E.O. Wilson, the biologist, said, quote, few scientists are philosophers. Most are intellectual journeymen, exploring locally, hoping for a strike, living for the present, unquote.
Yeah. Not the way Charles Darwin thought.
Right.
And Charles Darwin was deeply influenced by a number of philosophers in his own day. John Herschel was a very powerful influence on Darwin. William Whewell was a very powerful influence on Darwin. This discipline of combining a study of the history of science, I focus particularly on the history of biology, which, in my view, starts with Aristotle.
Could I ask you two questions first?
Yeah.
One thing, from what I've read, some of this hatred between philosophy and science and like physics came about from Hegel. Was Hegel a start of this, or would you pin it with someone else, or what?
Well, let's see. That's complicated. I would say that the biggest problem was, if you go all the way back to its source, is probably Immanuel Kant. Mm-hmm. And there's sort of two streams in modern philosophy that, if you trace it back, you'll find that they're both deeply influenced by Kantian ways of thinking. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher in the late Enlightenment. Hegel was very strongly influenced by Kant, but also were philosophers in the so-called analytic philosophical tradition. And Hegel strongly influenced Karl Marx and had a major influence on philosophy in France and Germany, and some influence on philosophy in England. But there was a reaction in England against the Hegelian idealist way of thinking that from a Hegelian point of view, the whole world is in fact spirit. And the evolution of the world spirit, as he called it, is a kind of inevitable spiritual march of which we have no control over, and which is basically not something that we partake in. It's something that sort of happens to us, if you like. People in the logical empiricist tradition in England reacted to that by saying that's all nonsense. And basically they said any metaphysics, any any speculation about the nature of reality was like poetry. They said it had no real intellectual intellectual value, um, and that's kind of there's a split between their view was that anything that can't be directly verified by experience is um, metaphysical nonsense. We don't want to have anything to do with it. And but from their point of view, the logical empiricist point of view, philosophy was just the study of logic and the logical syntax of language. And so to study a science philosophically was just to study the the um, the peculiar kind of conceptual network and language associated with a particular science. So it basically cut science off from questions about the nature of reality, the nature of human thought, and how human thought um, has to be performed in order to understand the natural world, in order to understand reality. Those questions were no longer legitimate. Um, and those were questions that thinkers like Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin um, were constantly thinking about. It was, you know, Newton saw himself as trying to get a deeper understanding of reality, and he is famous for developing techniques of inductive reasoning and inductive thinking that he thought were absolutely crucial to getting a deeper understanding of reality. Um, so, yeah, I think Hegel only in the negative sense of being a kind of the kind of idealist philosophy that Hegel represents became this kind of whipping boy for philosophy in the Anglo-American world, and we don't want to have anything to do with that. If that's what philosophy is, we don't want to have anything to do with it.
True.
And what they were trying to do is reduce philosophy to just a study of the logic of language, basic logic of scientific language. And that's it. That's all we're really interested in. So Rudolf Carnap is the representative of that way of thinking, and he saw philosophy as an analysis of the logical syntax of language, is what he put it.
Mm-hmm.
Induction becomes probability theory.
Mm-hmm. And so, give folks more context. See, there's more going on if they want to dig into this more. It's not just like Lennox is some isolated radical with some like far position that no one believes. So here's like E. Bright Wilson, professor of chemistry at Harvard, from An Introduction to Scientific Research. I don't recall when it was written, but I'll link to this in the show notes so people can look it up. Quote, practical scientists who rashly allow themselves to listen to philosophers are likely to go away in a discouraged frame of mind, convinced that there is no logical foundation for the things they do, that all their alleged scientific laws are without justification, and that they are living in a world of naive illusion. Of course, once they get out into the sunlight again, they know that this is not so, that scientific principles do work, bridges stay up, ellipses occur on schedule, and atomic bombs go off. Nevertheless, it is very unsatisfactory that no generally acceptable theory of scientific inference has yet been put forward. Mistakes are often made which would presumably not have been made if a consistent and satisfactory basic philosophy had been followed, unquote.
Yeah.
And if we look at some of Newton's rules of reasoning, I'll post these as well, like number 4, rule 4 of Newton's 4 rules of reasoning. Isaac Newton, the great scientist who knew what he was doing to a great extent, quote, rule 4, in experimental philosophy, we are to look upon propositions inferred by general induction from phenomena as accurately or very nearly true, notwithstanding any contrary hypothesis that may be imagined, till such time as other phenomena occur by which they may be made more accurate or liable to exceptions, unquote. So that's philosophy. And how would you distinguish for folks philosophy versus science? What's philosophy? What is science?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, branches of philosophy, let's just take them. Starting with metaphysics, Aristotle defined it as the study of being qua being. That is the study of the most fundamental questions you can have about the natural world. Do the things in the natural world have identity? If I penetrate to understanding them, will I discover that they are things that always behave in the same way, always behave according to their nature? Is reality, is the external world, if you like, the world that I observe, independent of my consciousness, or independent of any consciousness? Or is it something that is under the control or influenced by some kind of consciousness, whether God or my own? So, basic questions like that. These are questions that, for example, if you want to begin to study something scientifically, if you've been taught a metaphysics that tells you that nothing in the natural world is stable, that just because the sun came up yesterday doesn't mean it's going to tomorrow, just because the birds you've been watching are flying today doesn't mean they won't turn into some other kind of thing tomorrow. If you can't sort of rely on the world being a stable thing that's independent of your or anybody else's wishes or desires and so on, then you can't be sure. You can't ever develop any kind of certainty about the things you're studying. So basically, there are philosophical questions that need to be answered about causation, about identity, about the natures of things, that need to be settled in your mind before you do science. Because science only works, as that quote you read, I think, implicitly recognizes. Science only works given that you can know that the world is a stable place that will follow laws based on the identities and natures of the things that you're studying. If you can't be sure about that, then you can't be sure about anything that you're going to learn about the natural world by studying it scientifically. Now, I think generally speaking, if I would say there's sort of two notions of science. One notion of science, I think, I would say all the branches of philosophy are scientific. Mm-hmm. That is, if by science, one means a kind of rigorous knowledge of the world based on a proper way of forming concepts and a proper way of linking those concepts and a proper way of thinking rigorously by means of both inductive and deductive logic. Then, when you're doing metaphysics, when you're doing the study of being qua being, the study of reality, that's a science. Likewise, it's not uncommon to hear some thinkers, Ayn Rand does this, talk about the science of ethics. So another branch of philosophy is the study of ethics, the study of the codes of values that people need to govern their lives so that they live successfully. Again, if you think about that from the standpoint of being rigorous, careful, defining your concepts carefully, forming your concepts carefully, thinking rigorously using inductive and deductive logic, then you could say there's a science of ethics. But ethics is a normative discipline. Epistemology is also a normative discipline. That is, ethics and epistemology, two branches of philosophy, are raising and answering questions about the way human beings need to think, need to form concepts, need to reason in order to gain reliable knowledge about the world. So it has to do with how the human mind, the human consciousness, relates to the world, and the rules and norms that it needs to follow in order to gain knowledge about that world. In the case of ethics, you are thinking about how human beings have to act and the norms and values that they need to follow in order to act successfully in the world, in order to achieve the values they want to achieve. So in both those cases, it's normative in the sense that there are norms that one needs to define, first of all, and then follow faithfully in order to achieve knowledge on the one hand, or in order to live successfully, have a successful life on the other hand. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, philosophy is quite different from the natural sciences or mathematics, let's say. In both cases, though, the general answers to the general epistemological questions take priority. When you're studying genetics, let's say, when you're studying the genes, when you're studying any area of natural science, you have to follow the same epistemological norms. You have to form concepts properly. There are norms for proper concept formation. If you don't follow them, your concepts won't actually reflect the things that you've been studying properly. There are rules for proper definition, and you need to follow those rules in the study of chemistry or biology or anywhere else, just like you do in any other discipline. So again, there's a kind of priority of epistemology, of the theory of knowledge, that takes precedence over the sciences, I would say, in that you have to follow those basic epistemological rules in order to perform your scientific activities properly.
Oh, wait. I can't hear you.
I'm currently not speaking.
Okay, good. Okay, cool. I was going, oh no, did we have like internet failure or something? Okay, cool. Good. Yeah, so um sorry for the pause there, folks. I was like in a panic. But um yeah, and some of that is missing partly on purpose, partly on accident, because people aren't studying the history of sciences in schools as they should. Um, like right now, I have a student I'm tutoring. He's getting some private tutoring in physics um, twice a week, 11 years old. Um, he's advanced in math. He's got a tutor that works with him, and I don't know the details, but I think um, the parent said the parent said that the tutor has said that Jacob is done a lot of stuff up through pre-calculus or maybe up to pre-calculus, even though he's 11 years old. But yeah, we're going through physics and doing it in a way appropriate for him in a historical way, so he can learn mistakes people made, the thinking skills involved, the logic. I can point out the importance of philosophy, and give him notes and do it in a way so I know he's 11. He can only do so much. He's only going to get so much. But I say explicitly to him sometimes, look at this again. I'm giving you my notes. Look at them again when you're 15. Look at them again when you're 30. Look at them again when you're 50, because you'll get very different things every single time. You know, the stuff I'm going over, he'll get to some extent. And then when he's 15, he's got what we're doing now to build on, and what he's learned since then, and the consequences of him developing biologically and neurologically. Same thing at 30. So he'll get a lot more out of it later. But that philosophy and thinking skill stuff is very important. And then if people see, when they learn that, you know, right now it's like some people think, they didn't come up with calculus when back then, they weren't very smart, they were stupid. No, it's because there were some philosophical errors or some things unknown. There were like, who is it? Cheney or Rumsfeld or someone says, there are the known knowns, there are the known unknowns, and there are the unknown unknowns. People have to go through and figure out, there are unknown unknowns, make them known unknowns, and then make them known knowns. That has to happen in history before we get to this point, and they had to do that. So one reason the Greeks couldn't get calculus was because they had some bad philosophy. They thought you could not know change. You could not measure it. It took time in history, and Newton had to function as an epistemologist to see, yes, you can measure change, and this is how we do it. Then he could apply that to physics. Change is knowable. That's a philosophic point. Or the epistemology, like, because of Platonic epistemology, we had Ptolemy. Then we had to see Kepler says, no, you need to be more Aristotelian. And then the title of his book was A New Astronomy Based on Causes. And that's fundamentally a philosophical difference going on, not merely physics.
Yeah. I think there's a more complicated story to tell about what was going on between the Greeks.
You would, because you're such an expert at it.
Well, in particular, I mean, Ptolemy developed a fairly sophisticated trigonometric way of measuring changes in the relative positions of the heavenly bodies. Mm-hmm. And he had very a long history of data that he was using to test the measurements and make them more accurate and so on from Babylonian times on forward. Archimedes also had developed techniques for measuring, for example, changes in the volume of certain objects. And I think Archimedes in particular had a huge influence on Galileo.
Yeah.
And Galileo, I would say one of his major concerns throughout his life was accurately measuring change, and particularly accurately measuring one change relative to another change. So an awful lot of his work is concerned with that. So I think there's a sort of, during that period when almost all of Greek learning was buried, so that nobody except a few monks were actually studying it. Very little happened. But up through, say, the 3rd or 4th century AD, in Greek and Greek-influenced Roman scientists, there was a lot of progress being made in the science of measurement and in applying the science of mensuration to various kinds of natural phenomena. That came to a stop at the end of the Roman Empire, and nothing really started moving again until the 13th century. The recovery of the Greek manuscripts, first in Arabic translations that were then translated into Latin, and then the recovery primarily due to the conquering of the Byzantine part of the world by the Crusades, recovering the Greek manuscripts that were still in libraries and monasteries in the Byzantine world, and the translation then directly from the Greek into, and all of a sudden, within 100 years, people are realizing, oh, the Greeks had figured all this stuff out and we had lost it. Aristotle is recovered, Archimedes is recovered, Galen is recovered, Plato's dialogues are recovered, Greek optics, Greek harmonics, Greek astronomy, all of the manuscripts are eventually recovered, translated into Latin. People start studying it. Thomas Aquinas, heavily influenced by Aristotle, introduces Aristotelian ideas into the philosophical mainstream. At that point, totally dominated by Christianity, which had been heavily influenced by Neoplatonism. And Aquinas is trying to pull off a sort of integration of Aristotelian ideas with Christian theology. But at the same time, Greek astronomy, Greek mathematics, Greek medicine, Greek biology is being recovered as well. And I think by the time you get to Descartes and Newton, you can sort of watch in the history of mathematics and its application to the natural world, sort of quite gradual and steady progression towards what Newton accomplishes by developing the calculus of infinitesimals. So it's knowing the history allows you to disabuse yourself of the idea that Newton sort of dropped out of heaven. Here's this solitary genius who just out of his head made up calculus.
And God said, let there be Newton, and
Yeah,
there was light.
and there was light. That's right.
That's a
Um,
poem, folks, in case I
yeah,
forget who wrote that, but that's from a poem. So,
uh, I did know.
yeah, me too.
It might come to me. Um, yeah, so um, the you learn that by studying the history of. Um, there's a number of medieval late scholastic thinkers um, who were trying to um, apply techniques of geometry to local motion. Um,
Mhm.
they had a fairly strong influence on Galileo as well. But I think the big influence on Galileo was the mechanical way of thinking that you get out of Archimedes. And starting Galileo was one of those people who started applying the science of mechanics, which in the Greek world was literally the science of machines.
Hmm.
He started thinking about the natural world using those same principles that were being used in the science of mechanics in the Greek world.
And he would, so folks know, he'd go often to the shipyards of his local city to see what they were doing, to see what he could learn about physics from the engineering that was there.
Yeah, yeah, he was very heavily influenced by the science of engineering was developing very rapidly at the same
Hmm.
time, and he was paying very careful attention to how they were accomplishing what they were accomplishing.
And how would you rate his, um, or what could you say about the influence of Archimedes and Apollonius on him? Um, Apollonius more mathematical, Archimedes both mathematical and mechanical, or what?
I'd say Archimedes was. Um, I'm not sure you could divide things up that way. I think it was the way Archimedes used mathematics to understand um, the uh, interactions between objects and the transmission of motion from one object to another,
Hmm.
and the way he used mathematics to um, develop principles of change in different domains. Um, Archimedes was a pretty amazing mathematician, and I think um, uh, the mathematics was impressive to Galileo, but I think even more so um, the the way in which Archimedes used mathematics to help get a deeper understanding of the interactions between objects
Hmm.
and um, the the way to understand one change in relationship to another change.
Hmm. Interesting. Makes sense. Like, what kind of things in particular besides like the law of the lever or buoyancy?
Um, well, I was when I said that I was thinking of those two things in particular,
Mm-hmm. How
and
would
I'm
you?
not a, I'm
Sorry.
not a scholar of Archimedes, but it's those cases that I had in mind when I was saying what I was saying that uh,
Mm-hmm.
he's you know well known for having built or at least designed a number of machines that could be used in warfare, and um, it the science of the lever was a very important part of that. Um, uh, the understanding of buoyancy is really, in part, a matter of figuring out an accurate way um, to compare weights of different objects and compare weight in relationship to density and um, accurately measure changes in volume, which hadn't which hadn't been done before. So yeah, lots of things like that.
And the Arabs developed some of that when they discovered some of Archimedes' writings. For a period of time there, they made some advancements.
Oh yeah, in optics and in harmonics, in astronomy, in medicine, there was a real uh, there was a translation mill basically going on in Baghdad. Uh, what had happened was um, under the influence of a fairly fundamentalist form of Christianity, um, the pagan learning was being discouraged uh, in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 5th century, and people were taking all of the manuscripts to what is today Syria, and they were getting translated um, into a variety of languages, but eventually those manuscripts found their way to Baghdad. They were getting translated into Arabic there, and um, as Islam spread across northern Africa and into Sicily and Italy and Spain, um, that learning gradually came back to Europe. It came back to Europe primarily initially through the influence of Arabic scholarship. But they weren't just translating those manuscripts. The same thing happened in Baghdad that happened in Europe 3 or 4 centuries later. First, they got their minds around what the Greeks had accomplished, and then they started trying to develop those ideas in various ways. Um, so Al-Farabi and Avicenna and Averroes and so on were making all these um, uh, advances on what the Greeks had accomplished. Alhazen in optics, yeah,
I don't throw
quite
in a
amazing.
parent. Go ahead,
And
sir.
it's a part of the story of the relationship between uh, the Arab world and the European world that people should have a better understanding of today, because it wasn't always that the Arab world was primarily governed by this, fundamentalist uh, Islamist form of thinking that is prominent today. There was a time when they had a kind of enlightenment, again, greats of the Greeks,
Mm-hmm.
but because of the influence of Greek philosophy and Greek science on them, in the same way that when the Greek philosophical and scientific texts were recovered in the 11th and 12th century in Europe, um, we see the beginning of the Renaissance in Europe, the rebirth of rationality, the rebirth of scientific thinking, the rebirth of um, rigorous philosophical thinking that had been basically suppressed um, by the dominance of Christian theology um, in the period from the basically the 4th century AD through to the 10th or 11th century.
Then again, that shows the underlying importance of philosophy. They had to get the philosophy, get it right in the first place, and then they could have the Renaissance. Or as part of some of the documents, scrolls going to Baghdad, um, again, there's a philosophic influence there because otherwise some of them would just be burned. It's
Yeah,
evil. That's a moral judgment. That's philosophy. It's
that's why
heretical.
they were. That's why people were taking them
Yeah.
out of the Byzantine Empire, because they were sure that either they would just get buried and forgotten about, or more actively, they would actually be burned because there was a general view that pagan learning was going to distract you and detract from your proper Christian upbringing. You know, what you should be studying is the Word of God and the sacred texts, and to study anything else, especially if those texts might contradict the sacred texts, would be to condemn you to hell. And with that kind of attitude, those texts were definitely under threat.
Mm-hmm.
And
so there's the philosophy there where there's the explicit or implicit drive to commit more to the social group than to reality. And I think what they called some of that distraction from the word was, didn't they call it? It was like the sin of the lust of the eyes. That's what science and physical science was regarded as, giving into the lust of the eyes, and we need to forbid that and prevent people from doing that and train them to do otherwise.
Yeah. And you see the influence, sort of slight influence of Neoplatonism there, right? Because in the Republic, Plato said, if you want to know the world of forms, you don't want to be distracted by the sights and sounds around you. You have to turn your eyes towards the heavens, towards the true forms of things, the not the world of phenomena that you see around you and hear around you, but rather another dimension where things are beautiful and perfect and never changing, and so on. So that idea of turning away from the world of sensory experience, from the world of pleasure, from this worldly things, towards a heavenly world, is a kind of, you can see the influence of Neoplatonism there, and that influence of late Platonism on the early Christians is pretty well documented historically.
Mm-hmm. And then both Aristotle and Galileo and others had to deal with that, but in different ways. Aristotle, he was a student of Plato for 20 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, you'd know which book it's in, I've forgotten, but he's trying to convince these Platonists to study biology, and they've all got their eyes turned away from human life, reality, biology, the beautiful plants and animals. They've turned away and they're looking at the stars, and he's got to try to say, look, there's this beauty down here. Why don't you enjoy it? And
yeah, well, you mentioned that one of my books was Aristotle on the Parts of Animals. That's actually a translation of his that I did from the Greek.
Cool.
For Oxford University Press. And the passage you're talking about is in chapter 5 of book 1.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Animals. Actually, let me just, we're going to have to finish up pretty soon, but let me just read you a little bit of that passage.
Cool, thanks.
Because it's people sometimes talk about Aristotle's writing being crabbed, and it even sounds like just notes and so on. Well, not this passage. So, among the substantial beings that are constituted by nature, some are ungenerated and imperishable through all eternity, while others partake of coming to be and perishing. It's turned out, however, that the study of the former things, that is, the eternal things, though they are valuable and divine, are fewer. For as regards both those things on the basis of which one would examine them, and those things that we long to know about them, the perceptual phenomena are altogether few. And he's talking about the heavens, the stars, the sun, the moon, planets. We are, however, much better provided in relationship to knowledge about the perishable plants and animals. We do, after all, live among them. For anyone wishing to labor sufficiently can grasp many things about each kind of animal. Each study, of course, has its attractions. Even if our contact with the eternal beings is slight, nonetheless, because of its surpassing value, this knowledge is a greater pleasure than our knowledge of everything around us, even as a chance, brief glimpse of the ones we love is a greater pleasure than seeing accurately many other and great things. Perishable beings, however, take the prize with respect to understanding, because we know more about them and we know them more fully. And furthermore, because they are near to us and more of our nature, they provide a certain compensation compared with philosophy concerning the divine things. And this is the next passage is the crucial bit. Since we've completed stating the way things appear to us about the divine things, so he's imagining that his students have already studied his book De Caelo on the heavens, it remains to speak about animal nature, omitting nothing in our power, whether of lesser or greater esteem. For even in the studies of animals disagreeable to perception, the nature that crafted them likewise provides extraordinary pleasures to those who are able to know their causes and are by nature philosophers. Surely it would be unreasonable, even absurd, for us to enjoy studying the likenesses of animals, as pictures, on grounds that we are at the same time studying the art, such as painting or sculpture, that made them, while not prizing even more the study of things constituted by nature, at least when we can behold their causes. If someone had considered, sorry, I'm jumping a bit here. This is a very famous passage. Even as Heraclitus is said to have spoken to those strangers who wished to meet him, but stopped as they were approaching when they saw him warming himself at the oven, he bade them, "Enter without fear, for there are gods here too." So too, one should approach research about each of the animals without disgust, since in every one of them there is something natural and good. For what is not haphazard, but rather for the sake of something. In Aristotle's teleology, the idea that every part of an animal is there for the sake of the animal's well-being. For what is not haphazard, but rather for the sake of something, is in fact present most of all in the works of nature, the end for the sake of which each animal has been constituted or has come to be takes the place of the good. And then he goes on to say that if you withdraw in disgust from studying animals by means of dissection, by means of cutting them up and looking inside them and poking around and so on, then you should feel disgust about yourself as well, because you're constituted in exactly the same way as those animals that you're studying. And then he says, anyway, you're not studying those parts just as material parts. You're studying them in order to understand their functions, in order to understand what they do biologically and what contribution they make to the life of the organism and to keeping it alive and flourishing. So it's a really beautiful passage. He's in book one of the parts of animals. He's defending the proper norms for the study of biology. That's what it's all about. How you have to study biology and how it's different from studying, say, the heavens or studying geometry or whatever other subject you might be studying. And that passage comes from the last chapter, which is sort of a summing up of the argument he's made about the value of studying living things and what's the proper way to go about studying them by focusing on the value and the function of the different parts that animals have, their different organs, and studying them from the standpoint of trying to search for the causes that explain why animals have the parts they do and why those parts perform the functions that they do. What value are those functions for the life of the organism?
Yeah, it's beautiful writing.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful passage, and I tried very hard in translating it to um, make sure that the elevated nature of the rhetoric came through in the passage, and not
Nice.
just
Thanks.
the words.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Um, yeah, and I was going to make some point about that, and I forgot. Maybe it'll come back to me. But one thing was Aristotle to the Platonists being like Galileo to the scholastics at his time, having to do something similar. Scholastics are all caught up in the words. Authority says this, authority says this. And Galileo's going to be like, no, immerse yourself in the evidence.
Yeah,
like,
which is very Aristotelian.
Yeah.
The scholastics were not behaving like like Aristotle. Galileo was, but they were carrying the flag of Aristotelianism at that time, and so it's unfortunate that not just Galileo, but many other people, Francis Bacon, who should have seen Aristotle as an ally, were saying negative things about Aristotle because in their mind, Aristotle was what they were hearing from their scholastic colleagues in the universities. That's a very unfortunate aspect of the 17th century, I think, is that even people like Newton saw themselves more as Platonists than Aristotelians.
Wow.
And
so folks know. Go ahead, sorry. Finish.
And what was going on was, I think, a combination of things, but one was a view that I have argued against in publications, that Aristotle was opposed to the application of mathematics to the natural world. That's a complete falsehood, but it's a falsehood that was pretty widely believed in the 17th century. And of course, in the 17th century, one of the great achievements that was taking place was more and more application of mathematics to intractable natural phenomena. And insofar as people saw that the advance, Plato is always thought to be the champion of mathematics in the ancient world because of the influence of Pythagoras on him and treatises of his where he would speculate about the underlying mathematical structure of the natural world and so on. But it's I think unfortunate that Aristotle became associated with a kind of logic chopping, scholastic way of thinking when he would have definitely been on the side of the angels in the 17th century if he'd been alive. I read Francis Bacon, and he sounds so Aristotelian to me that when I come across the few passages in Bacon where he criticizes Aristotle, I'm thinking, no.
Yeah, same. It's sad. Yeah, it hurts my heart.
So one of the things I've been doing in the last 5 or 10 years is there's a real burgeoning rebirth of neo-Aristotelian philosophy. And I've been more and more taking part in that and trying to show how Aristotelian ideas are, first of all, not incompatible with anything that Charles Darwin would say. So I've written a number of papers pointing out the compatibility at a philosophical level of Aristotle's views about the natural world and his philosophical views and Darwin's. And at the same time explaining why it's really bizarre to think that the evidence that convinced Darwin to start thinking evolutionarily, and not just Darwin, but Lamarck and Erasmus Darwin and lots of other people at the time, none of that evidence was available to the Greek world. And anybody in the Greek world that speculated about evolution, it was pure speculation. I mean, when you actually read the few attempts to tell a narrative history of the natural world by Empedocles or Anaxagoras or someone like that, you realize it's just speculation. It's nothing more than that. But at a philosophical level, there's nothing in an Aristotelian way of thinking about the natural world that is in any way incompatible with a Darwinian way of thinking about it. But more importantly, I've also been trying to influence those people calling themselves neo-Aristotelians today to get more serious about studying Aristotle. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because in a lot of cases, they haven't studied Aristotle very carefully. In a lot of cases, the influence is coming from Thomism, from St. Thomas Aquinas, but modern day Thomists.
Interesting.
And it, I think, would be very helpful for that burgeoning movement in philosophy to really think hard about how Aristotle himself would approach the questions and the topics that they're approaching. So quite often when they have these conferences, they'll want somebody, sort of the token Aristotle scholar, to come up. and I'm happy to play that. I'm happy to play that role.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, glad you do. But and then so folks can see, for right now, you dig into this, look at it on your own more. It's true, but here's some things you can know. It's not just reading into it that Darwin and Galileo are influenced by Aristotle. It's not making it up. It's not wishful thinking. So here's some short quotes right here. Atlenaes. Do you know how to pronounce his name? Atlenaess. Atlenaes. Am I doing that right? Or do you know? But in this book, Galileo Galilei, When the World Stood Still, quote, Galileo's radical renewal. Okay, unquote, wait. So he's renewing radically how science is done. Remember, that's philosophical. There's this philosophical change in how we're doing science from what was being done to what Galileo did, leading to Newton and everything. But, quote, Galileo's radical renewal sprang, nevertheless, from the Aristotelian mindset as it was taught at the Jesuits' Collegio Romano. Human reason has a basic ability to recognize and understand the objects registered by the senses. The objects are real. They have properties that can be perceived and then further processed according to logical rules. These logical concepts are also real, if not in exactly the same way as the physical objects. Unquote. Okay, that's someone else. But what about Galileo? Okay, Galileo himself, from the horse's mouth. This is from the second letter of Galilei to Mark Weiser on Sunspots, page 118 of my edition of Discoveries and Opinions of Galileo, translated by Stillman Drake, copyright 1957. I'll put a link in the show notes. Quote, okay, remember this is Galileo writing, quote, I should even think that in making the celestial material alterable, I contradict the doctrine of Aristotle much less than do those people who still want to keep the sky inalterable, unquote. That's the scholastics. Quote, for I am sure he never took its inalterability to be as certain as the fact that all human reasoning must be placed second to direct experience, unquote.
Yeah.
Galileo.
And I should say there's been a lot of very good scholarship in the last 30 or 40 years in sort of drawing out the influences. Galileo, that is, taught at the University of Padua for many years. And one of the things he did was regular lecture courses on Aristotle's posterior analytics, which is Aristotle's work on the philosophy of science. And there's a pretty wide-ranging scholarship now tracing the influence of Aristotelian ideas on Galileo. And So that that influence is now fairly widely acknowledged
In some circles,
in
not in the
some
culture in
circles.
general,
Well, yeah, that's right.
unfortunately.
But it always takes a while for
Yeah.
the what the scholars have discovered to trickle down, so to speak,
Mhm.
into the wider culture. But yeah, okay, I'm going to need
I
to
was going to say,
wrap up
I was going to say,
pretty
would you like to
soon.
wrap up, please? What last words do you have for folks?
I think so one thing that I would like to say is that in trying to get a better understanding of science, um, uh, think about those people in the history of science and study those people, those great figures in the history of science, and think about the independence of their thought and where that comes from. What kind of fundamental questions would a Galileo or a Newton or a Darwin uh, have to ask in order to set off on the new course that they set off on? And I think what you'll find, they are questions about what's the nature of knowledge, um, uh, how, uh, what's the best way to think about this subject, and um, and they'll also be thinking about things like the nature of change and the nature of causation and the nature of space and the nature of time and how um, the human mind is related to the reality that it's trying to understand. And if these great scientists that everybody acknowledges are great scientists um, are accomplishing what they're accomplishing because of the deep thinking they're doing about those kinds of questions, um, I think I think that shows you the way in which um, deep philosophical thinking is fundamental to to science. Um, and I think these things are best learned by looking at the history of science. Um, and and then just asking yourself the questions as you're reading these great historical figures and reading about them. How did they do that? How did they accomplish what they accomplished? How does a Charles Darwin um, go against um, the widely held views about the nature of the biological world, um, and accomplish what he accomplishes? As you read about him or about any of the other figures we've talked about, I think what you'll see is they were great philosophical thinkers. They were that first,
Mm-hmm.
um, and 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 as a consequence of that, um, uh, uh, independent, creative, scientific thinkers.
Mm-hmm. And getting not just being philosophical, but getting the philosophy right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And but that's to a great extent um, just being independent thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
Where we started at the beginning of this discussion is how important you realized becoming an independent thinker was in your own life, in your own
Yeah.
education.
Yeah.
Um, it would have been easy for Newton or Galileo, or especially when you think about what happened to Galileo for
Mm-hmm.
being an independent thinker. Thank goodness by the 19th century that the same thing could have happened to Darwin, given the heretical views that he was espousing. Um, but he lived in a culture where people were no longer put under house arrest for having heretical scientific views.
Or even
Uh,
people might not be aware. We know some about Galileo, but someone who lived around his time, I don't know if,
Bruno.
yeah, Bruno was burned at the stake. Did he know Bruno personally or just was aware of
You
him?
know, I may have known that at some point. I cannot recall whether they knew each other personally or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that was a little off tangent. Want to make sure you got to
Yeah.
go. Don't want to take too much of your time. And any other last words for folks?
No, I think that's good, Michael. Thanks. I've enjoyed this very much.
Awesome. Likewise.
Enjoyed making recontact with you as well.
Yeah. When I can actually like appreciate you.
Good talking to you.
But all right. Thank you very much. You have a good day. Thanks,
You
folks.
too.
Hope you appreciate it, and we'll talk to y'all soon.